In one of my previous videos, I explained how many people interpret Hegel through a materialist understanding of reality, and why I believe this interpretation is not only mistaken but impossible. If we're going to be precise, it is technically possible, but it makes no sense, and it is my opinion that it reveals a misunderstanding of why Hegel called himself an idealist. I have also noticed a similar misunderstanding regarding Plato and his explanation of how the material world comes into existence. I noticed that many people interpret Plato as if he proposed a kind of material reality which exists independently, which is then reconstructed by the intellect according to the ideal. This is not what Plato teaches. According to Plato, matter could never exist without ideas. Ideas are not simply a model according to which material world is shaped. They are a direct cause of its existence. Many people would argue that Plato clearly believed in the existence of matter or the material world. However, this misses the essential point. Every idealist philosopher accepts the existence of the material world, but they understand that this material reality is itself produced by ideas. Plato explains the emergence of matter from ideas through a space that exists between being and nothingness. His conception of matter is not matter in the ordinary sense. Instead, it is a kind of spiritual receptacle existing within nothingness, and this is what becomes matter. Plato calls this space chora, the realm in which the material world is brought into existence by the divine craftsman. In semiotics, chora is understood as the space that provides a place for being. Plato uses the concept to describe a receptacle, a space, often interpreted as a material substratum, although I do not believe this interpretation is accurate. Rather than being material, it is pure emptiness, an interval, and this is what we're about to prove by simply following what Plato himself wrote, not by listening to any kind of interpretation. In Plato's account, chora is described as a formless interval, similar to a state of non-being, within which the forms are received from the intelligible realm, where they originally exist, and are then copied into the changing forms of the sensible world. In this sense, chora gives space to becoming, functioning as a womb or a matrix. Plato describes it in the Timaeus as follows: "Moreover, a third kind is that of the chora, everlasting, not admitting destruction, granting an abode to all things having generation, itself to be apprehended with non-sensation, by a sort of bastard reckoning, hardly trustworthy, and looking toward which we dream and affirm that it is necessary that all that is be somewhere in some place and occupy some chora, and that that which is neither on earth nor anywhere in the heaven is nothing." He also writes, "So likewise it is right that the substance which is to be fitted to receive frequently over its whole extent the copies of all things intelligible and eternal should itself, of its own nature, be void of all the forms. Wherefore, let us not speak of her that is the mother and receptacle of this generated world, which is perceptible by sight and all the senses, by the name of earth or air or fire or water, or any aggregates or constituents thereof. Rather, if we describe her as a kind invisible and unshaped, all receptive, and in some most perplexing and most baffling partaking of the intelligible, we shall describe her truly. This is why I do not like referring to chora as matter. How can matter be formless or shapeless? Throughout the history of human thought, has matter ever truly been understood as something without form? When we think of matter, we usually imagine a solid substance such as wood or stone, or perhaps particles and atoms. None of these are formless. In fact, I would argue that formlessness is the very opposite of what we normally mean by matter. Plato did not believe in matter as modern philosophers or scientists usually define it. His concept of chora is better understood as a kind of chaos, a formless void capable of receiving meaning. It is through this reception of meaning that the material world, in its proper form, or what philosophers would ordinarily call matter, such as particles and atoms, comes into existence. If ideas are removed from this formless chaos, then there are no particles and there is no matter. For this reason, I do not think it is accurate to call chora matter, since doing so misrepresents Plato's philosophy. Plato did not argue that ideas simply exist within matter. Rather, he proposed something much closer to the view that ideas themselves bring matter into existence out of chaos or nothingness. This chaos is not an already existing material world waiting to be organized. It is not a collection of unarranged material upon which the demiurge imposes order through intellect. That interpretation is entirely mistaken. Instead, form and formlessness must be understood as such, as primordial forces that exist prior to reality, without any kind of addition of materials. It is crucial to understand that just like forms have no physicality, formlessness is of the same nature. It is just non-physical counterpart to the forms. Materials arise as a mixture of intellect that imposes form with formless chaos that can receive it. The space itself, however, is not matter. The proper way to understand Plato's view is to recognize that this space is complete emptiness. It is nothingness itself, a kind of chaos that is capable of receiving anything. And just as it is important to understand that Kora is not matter, it isn't entirely without its own nature. It is nothing, but at the same time it exists as a kind of reality, a chaos. In the Sophist, Plato writes that non-being or nothing is not the opposite of being, it is just of a different kind, which is why he calls Kora the third kind. When the demiurge brings the content of ideas through the intellect, Kora receives them, meaning form is received by formlessness, being by non-being, light by darkness, order by chaos. These are not opposing forces in Plato's philosophy, these are essential counterparts of the whole. I know that to a modern mind it sounds strange to say that being is received by non-being, but this is what Plato says, this is clear. Non-being is not understood as nothing, but as formless counterpart to form. It is not physical, it is just formlessness, and that's it. We can understand them as the primordial archetypes of father and mother. Once the mother receives this intellectual power, its receptive nature also plays a role in transforming this power into the material world. So these are two different kinds of powers, the power to give and the power to receive. They give rise to matter. This can be confusing, because we don't think in this way usually, so I want to clarify something very important that is absolutely crucial for understanding Plato's metaphysics. Do not confuse this. I am not saying that ideas or forms are directly taken by the demiurge and brought into chaos in order to make the world out of them. Forms or ideas are always beyond matter, but the function of the forms is that they give power to the intellect, and from this power intellect creates through ideas. Ideas do not reside in the intellect in order to be directly used. Ideas provide material that intellect receives, and through this power intellect thinks and creates. Ideas stand even beyond intellect itself. Intellect works because of ideas, not the other way around. In this way, ideas provide the intellect with its power for thinking, and with this material of thought intellect creates. So it is not that intellect gives rise to ideas and from them creates matter, it is the opposite. Ideas give power to the intellect and intellect creates with this power that ideas provide. This is how ideas can be the highest reality beyond everything that exists, while at the same time directly providing existence to every single thing. It is through the power of the intelligence that arises from ideas. For Plato, neither intelligence nor matter could exist without the ideas. This is also why Plato consistently describes the material world as a copy. He repeatedly refers to it as a copy because it does not possess original meaning. Every aspect of its meaning, including the shape and solidity of matter itself, originates from the eternal realm of ideas. A copy necessarily implies that something has been copied from an original source, and for Plato that copy is the material world. There is a profound difference between saying that the demiurge merely rearranged existing matter and saying that he brought the content of ideas into emptiness, thereby producing the material world as a copy. What this indicates, the conclusion I want you to reach, is that ideas are the primary reality that gives rise to everything else. We must not take anything, not even God, before ideas. So how is this possible? I want to warn you that what I am about to say is more of a metaphorical picture. I separate the content of ideas from ideas, but they are actually the same thing. I just want to make distinction between idea itself and how it is grasped by the intellect to paint a picture of how ideas stand at the top, while at the same time being the source of everything. For example, how divine craftsman constructs the universe according to a perfect model. He gains intellectual power or content from contemplation of this perfect model, and then uses this power gained through contemplation. So in a metaphorical way, We can describe ideas as eternal storage of information that can be grasped by the intellect, and this is how intellect gains intellectual material for use or creation. Intellect can endlessly take this material from this storehouse, and it will never disappear, because ideas are eternal and their content is eternal. Idea is the storehouse itself, and the content is what is stored within it, an endless content of its own kind. This is how ideas provide content to all things. It is not that things are the content of ideas. This is true for Hegel, but not for Plato. We will explore this difference in the later chapter, when discussing the relationship between universals and particulars. The difference is very subtle. For Hegel, ideas, or universals, contain particulars directly within themselves as their content. In this way, Hegel's universals and particulars are merged into unity, but for Plato universals remain primary. They are united with particulars in another way. For Plato, all content is found within universals or ideas themselves, and this content is taken by the intellect from the eternal storage or the idea. This content is then used for creation of particular things. So for Plato, universals do not contain particulars as their content. It is the opposite. Particulars contain the content of universals. This content is found by the demiurge within the ideas or universals themselves. Not physically, but through thinking, the demiurge grasps ideas with his intellect. In this way he receives the content of ideas, and particulars are then filled with this ideal content as the source of their existence. So Platonic idea can be imagined as the eternal storehouse that contains its ideal content as the material. For example, idea of beauty is a storehouse that contains beauty, and when intellect creates something beautiful, it takes from the storehouse, receives material, and uses it to create. Ideas provide content that is grasped by the intellect, and this content is what allows intellect to do anything. Without this storehouse of material, there would be no creation. Idea of the good, on the other hand, is what provides light to the mind and being to all other ideas. So this idea of the good is of special kind. It is a storehouse of light that allows intellect to think. Thus, without this idea of the good, there would be no intellect and no storehouse at all. Since idea of the good spreads its light through all other ideas, it fills their storage with content of their own kind, and it provides intellect with the power of using this material. The demiurge, therefore, does not discover matter waiting for him within chaos. He instead fills it with bodies, as Timaeus says in the dialogue. These bodies are made from the content of ideas by the demiurge, as it is said, according to the perfect model. Cora, or the receptacle, receives this content, which are the copies of forms. It does not contain them from the beginning. It receives them from the demiurge, from his ability to reach ideas through his intelligence, and take from the ideas intellectual material necessary to create these bodies that are then received into the womb or the receptacle. So for Plato, chaos, or the receptacle, does not contain being. The only thing that contains being, in Plato's philosophy, are the ideas. The world of becoming that arises within Cora receives this being from ideas through the intellect. A container already holds something, whereas a receptacle is defined by its ability to receive. Before it receives anything, it contains nothing at all. A receptacle becomes a container only after something has entered it. However, without the receptacle, there would be nowhere to enter. In this way, Cora plays equally important role in giving rise to material world, but it in itself is not the material world. Only in its union with the intellect it gives rise to becoming as a child conceived within its womb. This means that Cora possesses no kind of matter before the activity of the demiurge, and Plato never suggests otherwise. It is our materialistic way of thinking that struggles to imagine reality, without assuming that some solid substance had to exist from the beginning. We need to set aside this bias and simply pay attention to what Plato actually says. If Plato never calls Cora matter, why do we continue to claim that the demiurge encountered an already existing material world that merely required rearrangement? Either we are misrepresenting the text, or we have failed to understand it correctly. To me, it is clear that for Plato ideas are the primary reality, while everything else exists only as their consequence. Anyone who fails to grasp this has not fully understood Plato. This is precisely where many misunderstandings of Plato's philosophy begin. It is at this point that people imagine the absurd picture of Plato describing an ordinary material world existing alongside a completely separate supernatural realm in which ideas somehow reside. I find this interpretation deeply disappointing, and I genuinely struggle to understand how anyone arrives at such a conclusion. Plato teaches that ideas are accessed directly through the soul. When we encounter beauty in the material world, it immediately awakens the memory of beauty already present within the soul. There are no physically separate realms, there are only ideas, and the distinctions or hierarchy within the world of ideas are determined not by physical distance, but by differences within the psyche, within thought and understanding. Within Plato's philosophy, the universe is a soul, and what appears as physical change is, at its deepest level, a transformation within thought itself. Material change is governed by the world's soul through its own activity and intelligence. This does not mean that Plato denies the existence of matter altogether. Matter certainly exists, but it is not matter in the materialist sense. What truly exists is the eternal realm of ideas together with nothingness, the empty void, which possesses no material character whatsoever. These two realms, being and void, are connected through the divine intellect and the world's soul, both of which receive their existence as expressions of ideas. The void in itself is not a material space in the way it is often described, it is nothingness. It is not even properly a space, certainly not in a modern scientific or physical sense. It is a chaotic void, which represents the other end of the spectrum between being and non-being, between form and formlessness, harmony and disharmony, light and darkness. Once light enters this darkness, the world emerges as a combination of the two. It is neither pure light, nor is it pure darkness. And this is just a description of an emergence of the cosmos in a single cosmic cycle that we live in this moment. However, both light and darkness are infinite realities that mingle with one another for eternity, giving rise to reality, devouring it, and again producing it anew. At the end, we can conclude the receptacle or chora has a kind of strange nature of its own. Plato in fact says all we need to know, it is a receptive nature, but it is not material. To say it is material is an addition that Plato never used. This is what is most important here. That's why I want to clarify this. In fact, during Plato's time, the Greeks did not possess a word equivalent to the later concept of matter as a single hard substance from which all physical objects are made. It was only after Aristotle that this notion of matter gradually began to take shape, although even Aristotle understood reality as governed by mind, and his own concept of matter did not mean hard physical substance in the modern sense. So how could Plato's demiurge impose the content of ideas onto matter, if such concept of matter did not even exist? The very meaning of matter, as it would later be understood, had not yet been conceived. To us this may seem unusual, but if we think about it carefully, physical objects are made from many different kinds of substances. Nothing is simply made from a universal substance called matter. The Greeks had words for materials such as wood, stone, and iron, but they did not possess a concept that united all solid things under the single category of matter. For this reason, it makes little sense to claim that the demiurge merely rearranged pre-existing matter, because it is highly unlikely that Plato intended anything of the sort. When Plato speaks about the physical world, he usually does so through the language of the elements and their combinations, much like Empedocles and Anaxagoras. This misunderstanding most likely originated with Aristotle, who identified chora with prima materia. Yet even Aristotle's prima materia is not matter in the modern sense. Nevertheless, Aristotle writes in the Physics, "This is why Plato says in the Timaeus that matter and the chora are the same, for the receptive and the chora are one and the same." Although the manner in which he speaks about the receptive in the Timaeus differs from that in the so-called unwritten teachings, nevertheless he declares that place and the chora are the same. However, this does not imply that matter is primary. Chora is identified with matter because it receives the content of ideas through divine intelligence. It is identical with matter precisely because it receives, not because matter has always existed there as though inside a permanent container. If Cora already contained everything from eternity, why would Plato describe it as a receptacle? The very meaning of a receptacle is that it receives what it does not yet possess. If we claim that matter already existed, and that the demiurge merely arranged it through the power of his intellect, then ideas become secondary while matter becomes primary. This is completely incompatible with Plato's philosophy. Plato was not a materialist but an idealist, and this means that matter itself is the consequence of ideas. In this sense, Cora can indeed be identified with matter, but not because matter has existed there eternally. Rather, it is because Cora is the place where matter comes into being through the power of ideas. If ideas were removed from Plato's philosophy, matter would disappear as well. But if the entire material world were removed, only the copy would be lost, while the original reality of ideas would remain. Many philosophers have understood this point very well, but many ordinary readers have not. I have seen numerous presentations, especially on YouTube, describing Cora as though it was some kind of pure matter existing independently. This creates enormous confusion. It is for this reason that the Neoplatonists described matter as the indeterminate, or as that which lacks independent existence. Many people think this represents a departure from Plato, but I believe it is exactly what Plato himself taught. Matter possesses no independent reality. One of the greatest problems in modern philosophy is that philosophers are usually understood through popular interpretations rather than through their own writings, and these interpretations are often mistaken in one way or another. Instead of relying on interpretations, why not simply read the original texts? That, to me, is the only reliable way to understand a philosopher. Later interpreters transformed Cora into a material substratum or matter itself. In doing so, they completely separated matter from ideas and claimed that matter exists independently while ideas remain somewhere above it. Over the centuries, this misunderstanding developed to the point where some people speak as though Plato believed that only matter truly exists and that the demiurge simply organized it. In other words, the interpretation eventually became the exact opposite of what Plato actually believed. This kind of distortion is what frustrates me the most. It is not Plato's philosophy that people are discussing, but interpretations that often reverse his central ideas. Yes, Plato does believe that ideas are beyond everything, but not because they are separated from everything, but precisely the opposite. Everything depends upon their existence. Matter is an expression of divine intelligence that directly receives its being and power of thinking from the good. By filling chaos with this content or power received from the good, matter is created as a container that contains this intellectual content, just like human body contains the soul as its content. In this way, matter is a direct expression of ideas, a reflection of ideas in the mirror of chaos. Remove ideas and reflection disappears as well. Schelling, one of the German idealists, was deeply influenced by Plato, yet he argued that Cora, or the receptacle, must contain some kind of material substance. In other words, he recognized that Plato understood the material world as an image of eternity rather than as ultimate reality, but he believed that Plato had grounded reality too strongly in ideas and not sufficiently in nature. Schelling even used the expression image of eternity to criticize Plato's conception of the world. His aim was, in a sense, to naturalize Plato's philosophy. He believed that Plato risked portraying reality as entirely determined by eternal and unchanging meaning, thereby reducing the world to a form of absolute determinism. I agree with Schelling's interpretation that Plato grounded entire reality in ideas, but I do not share Schelling's conclusion in believing that this denaturalizes reality or that it leads into determinism. In fact, I have arrived at the opposite view. I believe that introducing matter as an independent entity takes away the fullness of life in nature and inevitably introduces aspects of determinism. What I mean by this, it prevents a proper ground for freedom, which is one of the crucial aspects of my thought. I believe that some things are determined, or at least seem to be determined, but this determinism is a byproduct or lower category that happens within the absolutely free living reality. In other words, if I had to choose whether reality is free or determined, I would say it is free, and determinism is just an interpretation of what happens through freedom. It is understanding that things are determined by events that are grounded in freedom. When we look at events that happened, we can see that some things cause other things, and those others were determined by those first ones. However, I believe that freedom is a higher category that contains determinism within itself. It is more fundamental. All that is determined is guided by freedom. The fact that every material thing is permeated with the content of ideas is exactly what allows us to think about an action and then bring it into reality. We shape reality through our thoughts, not merely by thinking in isolation, but by acting upon the world. Physical activity itself is, within idealism, a form of thinking. Even what appears to us as physical is ultimately an idea. Whenever we work with our hands, we are shaping reality through thought, because the physical world itself is an expression of thought. Even from the perspective of materialism, every act of creation requires thought. It is impossible to build or shape anything without first thinking about what one is doing. In this sense, even materialism implicitly acknowledges that reality is transformed through thought, because there is simply no other way for purposeful action to occur. Intelligence is the movement of ideas, and every form of activity or change depends upon it, regardless of the particular form that change takes. As soon as something is moving in a meaningful way, there is already intelligence operating behind it. If we carefully observe how human beings construct buildings, create ideas and ideologies, organize societies, or develop both physical and digital infrastructure, we can see that all of these achievements arise through the manipulation of meaning by means of the intellect. Just as Plato describes the divine craftsman constructing the world by creating it as a reflection of the eternal ideas, we ourselves continually construct every aspect of civilization by shaping the earth through both mental and physical activity. We shape reflections of eternal ideas through our intellect because the mental and the physical are not fundamentally different realities. Both are expressions of ideas. This way of thinking may initially seem strange or even absurd because our worldview has been deeply shaped by materialistic assumptions. These assumptions are so deeply rooted in our habits of thought that it becomes difficult to imagine reality in any other way. However, once we learn to approach the question without these inherited biases, we begin to see that the materialist picture raises far more difficulties than it resolves. It becomes increasingly difficult to explain how understanding, thought, language, and meaning could emerge from a completely lifeless material universe. We are expected to believe that dead matter somehow produced life, consciousness, imagination, symbolic thought, and the ability to conceive worlds that do not even exist. There are simply too many assumptions that must be accepted before such an explanation can begin to appear convincing. By contrast, if we allow ourselves to consider that reality is fundamentally composed of ideas and meaning, and if we genuinely understand what such a claim implies, many of these apparent contradictions disappear. We are able to understand reality through thought because reality itself is thought. We are capable of creating language and meaningful symbols because reality is itself an ordered structure of meaning. We are able to shape material objects by thinking about the process and then carrying it out because our hands, our tools, and everything around us are themselves expressions of ideas. Once everything is understood as idea or meaning, there is no need to introduce an additional substance called matter that requires its own separate explanation. The moment we make matter into an independent foundation of reality, we create an enormous explanatory barrier that every philosophical system must somehow overcome, even though such a barrier is unnecessary. We assume that matter must occupy this foundational role only because we have inherited a particular conception of what matter is, and we rarely question whether that conception is actually correct. It is difficult for us to imagine that what we call matter may possess an entirely different nature from the one we ordinarily assume. The greatest obstacle is not reality itself, but our own deeply rooted and often unexamined beliefs. Once again, I am not arguing that the material world does not exist. My claim is simply that matter possesses a fundamentally different nature from the one that is commonly assumed within the modern worldview. This is why I believe that reality, in its entirety, is literally a living organism, and that everything within it is shaped by thought or intelligence. Even what modern physics describes as dead matter is, in my view, permeated by intelligence. because this Platonic view of reality was largely misunderstood throughout history, especially in modernity. Many people have come to believe that Plato taught that material world is evil. In reality, Plato never makes such a claim. Quite the opposite. He presents the material world as good and perfect in accordance with its own nature. What Plato identifies as evil is not matter itself, but ignorance. Evil consists in believing that the material world is nothing more than inert matter devoid of ideal content. It arises from the assumption that matter exists independently of the ideas, when in fact the material world is governed by them. Once matter is recognized as a lower expression of the ideas, it is understood to be good. Evil is therefore never found in the existence of matter itself, but in the mistaken belief that matter possesses an independent existence apart from the ideas. Plotinus repeatedly praises the beauty of the material cosmos and explicitly argues against those Gnostic sects that regarded both the material world and its creator as evil. For Plato, then, the true problem is not nature or the world itself, despite the common misconceptions surrounding Platonism. Certainly, the material world occupies a lower place within the hierarchy of reality, yet it is neither evil nor unreal. It exists exactly as it ought to exist. However, because it belongs to a lower ontological level, people often fail to recognize it as an expression of the ideas and as something governed by reason. They instead assume that matter is primary, and it is precisely here that evil and illusion originate, not within the world itself, but within humanity's mistaken understanding of reality and its failure to acknowledge the primacy of soul, intellect, and reason in the governance of the cosmos. In this respect, Goethe also directed criticism toward Plato. Rudolf Steiner, who was influenced by both Goethe and Plato, later suggested that Goethe's understanding of Platonism reflected the philosophical climate of his own period, a period deeply shaped by Kantian idealism and the distinction between essence and appearance. Such a conceptual framework simply did not exist in Plato's own philosophical context. I have great admiration for Goethe, and his work has profoundly influenced my own thinking. He was, however, fundamentally a naturalist and an empiricist. He believed that knowledge could be attained through direct engagement with appearances in nature. Even so, within his scientific writings, he ultimately arrived at something resembling the concept of forms, although not in the Platonic sense. Goethe's forms remain deeply embedded within nature itself, rather than existing as an eternal and unchanging intelligible realm. For this reason, I can understand his criticism of Plato. Goethe objected to the idea that nature occupies a lower ontological level than the realm of the ideas. Nevertheless, Goethe also shared much with Plato. He never rejected Platonism altogether. Rather, he sought to relocate Plato's philosophy more fully within nature. Plato himself regarded nature as living, ensouled, and inherently valuable, much as Goethe did. The difference is that Plato also affirmed a transcendent divine dimension that stands beyond nature itself, whereas Goethe understood the divine as much more intimately united with nature than with transcendence. It can also be said that even Goethe, however, acknowledged a certain form of transcendence. Throughout his life, he wrestled with questions concerning God, nature, science, and the relationship between them. To discuss those issues in detail would require far more time than this discussion allows. It is sufficient to say that Goethe remained fundamentally oriented toward nature, and it was there that he found the foundation for most of his philosophical and scientific work. Although I regard Goethe's theories as extraordinarily valuable, I also believe that he grants too little independence and transcendence to the ideas themselves. Intellect and ideas possess the capacity to reach realities that appear to have little, if any, direct grounding in the natural world. I believe that dreams, certain altered states of consciousness, and even some drug-induced experiences can open pathways toward dimensions that cannot be fully explained through empirical observation alone. I have personally experienced altered states induced by drugs in which ordinary sensory input almost completely disappeared, leaving me in what seemed to be an entirely mind-like dimension. There were moments when I sat alone in a dark room, seeing and hearing virtually nothing, fully aware that I was receiving almost no sensory information, yet I nevertheless entered an extraordinarily vivid, dreamlike state that permanently transformed the way I understand reality. These experiences became one of the principal reasons I was drawn toward philosophical idealism, with its emphasis upon mind and ideas as the ultimate ground of existence. I still find it difficult to explain how I could simultaneously inhabit the physical world while experiencing another mode of reality that seemed entirely independent of my immediate sensory surroundings. These experiences also explain my deep interest in the ancient mystery traditions and in various esoteric and occult schools that speak of realities extending beyond ordinary sensory perception. When I was in high school, I regarded such claims as complete nonsense. I assumed that those who reported these experiences were either deliberately deceiving others or were simply confused by the effects of drugs. Even after I underwent similar experiences myself, I resisted accepting what had actually occurred. I actively searched for explanations that would reduce them to self-deception rather than acknowledging their full significance. I even speculate that Plato himself may have participated in some form of mystery initiation involving altered states of consciousness. Of course, this remains only my own speculation, but I find it difficult to explain in any other way how he could have developed a philosophical vision that extends so far beyond the ordinary world of sensory experience, especially when we take into consideration that at that time, science was very undeveloped, and people's daily lives were firmly rooted in their immediate contact with the material world. Yes, I place tremendous value on empiricism. Everything we observe and everything with which we come into contact passes through experience. Nevertheless, I also believe that certain kinds of experience are capable of elevating us beyond what is merely natural. In my view, there are dimensions that transcend the ordinary natural world, and these dimensions can be reached through the activity of the mind or the soul. At the same time, I have a profound reverence for nature itself. I do not regard nature as nothing more than an empirical reality available to the senses. Rather, I believe that nature possesses its own supernatural or spiritual dimension, something akin to the world soul described by Plato in the Timaeus, the living soul that underlies natural processes and directs their unfolding. For this reason, I have come to understand Goethe's archetypal forms as belonging to a kind of etheric realm that emerges at the level of the world soul. This is a supersensible dimension, inaccessible to the senses alone, yet apprehensible by the mind working together with sensory experience. I therefore conceive Goethe's science as belonging to a particular level within the Platonic process of emanation, the stage at which the divine intellect, or the demiurge, impresses copies of the eternal forms into the chora, the receptive womb of chaos from which the sensible world emerges. In this respect, I consider myself faithful to Plato while also incorporating insights from other thinkers, Goethe being one important example. His contribution can be understood as illuminating aspects of the lower realms of reality that Plato himself did not explain in great detail. I am not abandoning Plato in favor of Goethe. Rather, I believe Goethe's scientific discoveries can be situated within Plato's account of the emanation from being into becoming, specifically within the domain where nature itself comes into existence. Goethe's observations enrich Plato's understanding of the world of becoming without requiring us to abandon Platonism altogether. I fully recognize that Goethe was not a Platonist, nor do I wish to portray him as one. I am equally aware that he criticized Plato, and I actually regard many of those criticisms as legitimate. Precisely because I take Goethe's objections seriously, I believe they can strengthen rather than weaken Platonic idealism by helping us develop a richer understanding of the process through which ideal being unfolds into the realm of becoming. Goethe's conception of archetypal forms refers to the underlying formative principles through which nature expresses itself. These include what he called the Urphenomen, or primal phenomenon, together with the Urbild or typus, the archetypal form that reveals itself through continual metamorphosis rather than existing as a fixed Platonic essence within nature itself. Through these concepts, Goethe sought to unite science, morphology, and metaphysics by understanding nature as a living, self-organizing whole. He believed that beneath the constant flux of appearances there exists a primal phenomenon, not an abstract scientific law, but an immediately intuited pattern according to which nature organizes itself. This is not a Platonic form existing outside the world of change. Rather, it is the simplest and most fundamental expression of a natural process, grasped through intuitive perception, Anschauung, rather than through mathematical abstraction. Goethe therefore proposed an alternative to the reductionism of modern physics. Instead of reducing nature to equations, he sought to discover the living formative pattern that continuously generates natural phenomena. Within his morphological studies, Goethe argued that every organic form represents a transformation of a single archetypal structure. In botany, this appears as the Erbpflanze, the primal plant from which every plant organ develops as a transformation of the leaf. In anatomy, it appears in the vertebral theory of the skull, according to which the bones of the skull are transformed vertebrae. These archetypes are fundamentally dynamic. They are not static templates imposed upon nature, but formative principles governing continuous transformation. Nature does not manufacture fixed objects. Rather, it generates ongoing processes from which forms continually emerge. For this reason, Goethe's archetypes should be understood as living principles of formation rather than immutable blueprints. I do not believe that this stands in opposition to Platonism. On the contrary, Plato himself maintains that only the forms are eternal and unchanging, while simultaneously affirming the existence of the divine intellect and the world soul, both of which are responsible for motion and development throughout the cosmos. Plato never denies transformation or change. Instead, he argues that change itself is grounded in eternal archetypes that provide order and intelligibility to every process of becoming. This should not be interpreted as meaning that everything is predetermined in advance. Rather, freedom and change unfold within an intelligible structure. The principle through which change occurs cannot itself be merely another instance of change. Even change possesses its own unchanging intelligible pattern. Plato would therefore say that change itself is a lower emanation of an eternal form. The very nature of change remains constant. This is what Platonic forms are. They do not restrict anything. We could even imagine a form of unrestrictability. This is form. It is completely independent of reality. It provides a blueprint or a pattern through which reality may unfold in some aspects or situations, while in other aspects and situations, it doesn't follow this same pattern. For example, if we use a form that signifies unrestrictability, expansion of space may be unrestricted, or a sequence of numbers, while the mass of a black hole or the number of trees in the forest may be restricted. As Carl Jung said, each single event is filled with endless archetypal patterns. Each thing in reality has its own participation and is constructed from combinations of various archetypal patterns. In this way, these archetypes or forms, they actually provide stability for completely unrestricted development. Whenever anything changes, there is always an underlying form that gives every instance of change its identity and intelligible structure. In this sense, Platonic forms do not impose limitations upon reality. They exist entirely beyond restriction and beyond direct involvement in the mutable affairs of the sensible world. The ideas provide the intellectual substance through which intellect is able to think, create, and act. They furnish the intelligible material upon which intellectual activity depends, yet they do not constrain what intellect may accomplish with that material. Intellect remains genuinely free in the way it employs the eternal forms. This flexibility is precisely why I regard Plato's philosophy as capable of embracing virtually every philosophical tradition while remaining authentically Platonist. Platonism is not simply one philosophy among many. It already contains within itself the diverse philosophical currents that existed during Plato's own time. In this sense, Platonism is not a single rigid doctrine, but a synthesis capable of integrating many different perspectives. Platonism does not define itself primarily through opposition to competing philosophies. Instead, it absorbs them, transforms them, and incorporates them into a broader philosophical vision. Even apparently incompatible thinkers, such as Heraclitus and Parmenides, are taken up into Plato's system and reconciled within a higher unity. From this perspective, Goethe's philosophy becomes one valuable contribution among many. enriching Platonism and nourishing our understanding without replacing its foundations. This, in my view, is how a true Platonist approaches philosophy, never by struggling against ideas, but by receiving them, examining them through dialectic, and allowing each genuine insight to contribute to the soul's continual ascent toward the knowledge of the Absolute. Goethe and Plato actually agree on many fundamental points. Both understand reality as an organic, living whole rather than as a collection of lifeless objects. If we understand Plato's metaphysics as a continuous process of emanation from being into becoming, then Goethe's archetypes could be placed precisely at the stage where being begins to unfold into becoming. I would even describe this as an etheric sphere. It is neither a pure Platonic form nor ordinary matter, but rather an intermediary etheric dimension. Many esoteric traditions speak about such an etheric realm. It can be understood as existing somewhere between body and soul, belonging more to the soul than to material existence. From this perspective, Goethe's philosophy of nature becomes a form of Platonic natural philosophy. His scientific investigations, especially his work on morphology, color theory, and the concept of the urphenomen, rest upon a metaphysical vision that closely resembles an immanent and dynamic form of Platonism. Contemporary scholarship increasingly recognizes that Goethe's science was never anti-philosophical. On the contrary, it is grounded in the conviction that nature is a living, self-organizing whole whose intelligible order can be directly encountered. Within Plato's Timaeus, there also remains an ongoing debate concerning the entities that enter into and pass away from the receptacle. Plato makes it clear that these are not the eternal forms themselves. Some interpreters have suggested that they should instead be understood as character types, or particular expressions derived from the forms, functioning as copies that occupy the receptacle. Whether or not this interpretation is ultimately correct, Plato explicitly states that what the receptacle receives are bodies. These bodies are three-dimensional realities, making it more likely that Plato refers to the coming into existence and passing away of observable individual things rather than merely to their abstract qualities. These bodies themselves possess a deeper geometrical foundation. The four classical elements, fire, air, earth, and water, which constitute the physical universe, are built from the Platonic solids, and these solids are themselves composed from two fundamental kinds of triangles. Even the material world, therefore, possesses an intelligible mathematical and metaphysical structure that ultimately derives from higher principles. When the demiurge fashions the cosmic body, he employs the four elements in perfect proportion. Following the eternal model, he creates a single complete living body that is whole, perfect, immune to old age and disease, and spherical in form. Because the cosmos is intended to be entirely self-sufficient, it requires nothing external to sustain it. It therefore possesses no eyes or ears, no atmosphere for breathing, and no organs of digestion. Likewise, it has neither hands nor feet, and its motion is not linear but rotational, turning continuously upon itself. Although this cosmic body may appear strange when compared with ordinary living creatures, Plato intentionally presents it as the perfect image of a living universe. The creation of the world soul follows immediately afterward, and this remains one of the most difficult passages in the Timaeus. Plato explains that the demiurge fashions the substance of the soul by combining seemingly opposite principles, the indivisible with the divisible, and the same with the other. At first glance, these appear impossible to unite, and Plato deliberately leaves the full philosophical implications of this mysterious synthesis for the reader to contemplate. It is precisely within this part of Plato's cosmology that I would locate Goethe's archetypes. I see them existing within the receptacle itself, occupying an intermediate level between the body and the soul of the universe. Here the divine craftsman introduces intelligible principles into the receptive matrix, where they undergo continual transformation. These archetypal patterns participate in the ongoing processes through which things come into being, develop, change, and eventually pass away. Goethe's urphenomen represents the simplest and most irreducible phenomenon through which nature reveals its inner law. It is directly observable, cannot be reduced to mathematical equations, and marks the boundary of genuine knowledge. One cannot explain why it exists exactly as it does. One can only recognize that it does. In this respect, Goethe's conception harmonizes remarkably well with Plato's understanding that genuine knowledge consists in grasping the essential intelligible structure underlying reality. The principal difference is that Goethe insists this insight is achieved through intuitive perception working together with observation, whereas Plato places greater emphasis upon intellectual contemplation. Plato summarizes the complete metaphysical structure of the Timaeus by distinguishing three inseparable principles. First, the eternal and unchanging forms, which function as the model or father. Second, the receptacle, which serves as the mother. And third, the copies of the forms, the offspring produced through the union of the model and the receptacle. These should not be understood as three separate substances existing independently of one another, but as three inseparable aspects of a single metaphysical process through which reality continually unfolds. It is within this unfolding that I believe Goethe's archetypes naturally belong. His formative principles resemble the living copies that emerge within the receptacle as the eternal intelligible patterns are expressed throughout the changing world of becoming. This is especially evident in his study of morphology, where every organ of a plant is understood as a transformation of one fundamental archetypal form, the leaf. Rather than contradicting Plato, Goethe offers a deeper account of the manner in which eternal intelligible principles become visible within the living processes of nature. This reflects a deeply Platonic principle, unity underlying multiplicity, expressed not primarily through abstract metaphysics, but through the living processes of biology. Goethe argued that the bones of the skull are transformed vertebrae, illustrating once again how a single archetype can unfold into a diversity of forms. These are not intended as mechanical or reductionistic explanations. Rather, they function as formative principles that closely resemble living Platonic forms. Goethe strongly opposed Newton's attempt to reduce color to measurable physical components alone. In his view, this kind of analysis amounted to a torture of nature, an expression that echoes the spirit of Plato's Timaeus. Goethe believed that when we dissect natural phenomena into isolated parts, we destroy the very reality we seek to understand. Both Goethe and Plato share what has often been described as an Orphic epistemology. Nature is understood as a living whole that should not be forced into artificial experimental conditions, but approached through attentive, participatory perception. From this perspective, Goethe's theory of color should not be interpreted as anti-scientific. Rather, it opposes a purely mechanistic conception of science and rests upon a profoundly Platonic respect for the integrity and living unity of nature. According to Plato, the cosmos came into existence as a single living creature endowed with both soul and reason, visible to perception while simultaneously containing within itself every other living being that naturally belongs to it. Its structure follows mathematical principles together with the harmonious numerical proportions inherited from the Pythagorean tradition, especially those governing the motions of the 7 classical planets: the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These celestial movements embody the harmony, order, and intelligible structure that characterize the universe as a whole. Plato further identifies the cosmos itself as a divine living being, giving it the names Uranos and Cosmos. In doing so, he brings together earlier mythological traditions with philosophical reflection. As many scholars have observed, Plato mediates between the poetic inheritance of ancient Greece and the philosophical insights of the Presocratics, uniting both within a single coherent cosmology. By bringing together mythology, philosophy, mathematics, and cosmology, Plato constructs a unified vision of reality in which the universe itself is understood as a living, rational, and divine organism. For this reason, I do not see philosophy, knowledge, religion, or wisdom as inventions of the human mind. I see them as direct expressions of existence itself. Philosophy is not something that human beings merely created as an intellectual discipline alongside subjects such as biology or mathematics. Rather, those disciplines are only more specialized branches within the broader domain of philosophy. In my understanding, philosophy is woven into life itself. It is actually our relationship with the Mother Earth, which in Platonic, Christian, or Gnostic systems would be called the world soul, the Holy Spirit, or Sophia, personification of wisdom itself. Before Pythagorean and Platonic focus on the soul and mind, the archetypes of father and mother, as well as other gods, were mostly symbolized as personifications of material properties of reality, like Father Sky and Mother Earth. In Greek myth, they were called Uranus and Gaia. However, after Pythagoras and Plato, and their heavy influence on later Hellenistic systems that were merged with Jewish scripture, the time when Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and Christianity existed together, father and mother were no longer material entities like earth and sky, they became mind-like or soul forces. We can characterize them as aspects of cosmic intelligence, like God the Father and Wisdom or Mother Sophia. In this way, Sophia or Wisdom is Mother Earth. She represents the receptive and sustaining principle. She is the womb that receives power of knowledge from the Father and transforms it into truth and life. In this way, philosophy or the love of wisdom is not merely a feature of behavior or intellectual discipline, it is relationship with reality itself. Relationship with Mother Earth, which is no longer material Earth. Now she is Sophia, or wisdom that sustains all souls within its womb in a community of earthly life. She is at the same time community of all souls sustained through wisdom, and she is, in Christian Gnostic sense, a community of living souls that make up the Church, or heavenly Jerusalem, those who keep the commandments of God and those who are in alignment with God's will. This community is the main symbol of the end-time prophecies, where Sophia or Mother Earth can be either Holy Queen of Heaven, God's wife as the Church, or she can become the whore of Babylon, the devouring mother that drinks the blood of the saints and is filled with abominations of the earth. This is, in my view, the true essence of philosophy. It is not something that humans invented. What we invented can be seen as a symbolic interpretation through language of our relationship with reality, the relationship that is in itself a love of wisdom or philosophy. I also believe that philosophy and religion are ultimately the same reality viewed from different perspectives. Every form of human thought is expressed through philosophy and religion, and the two cannot truly be separated. Every religion contains a philosophy, and every philosophy functions, in some sense, as a religion. Neither of them is simply a product of thought. They are expressions of thinking itself. They arise naturally from the simple fact that living beings exist. Animals also possess life and soul, and therefore they possess their own forms of philosophy. Their manner of hunting, feeding, raising their offspring, defending themselves, and organizing their lives expresses a system of values. The degree to which they value their own survival, the willingness to protect their young, or even to sacrifice themselves for others, reflects principles that guide their behavior. Like human beings, animals are embodiments of Platonic forms such as justice, courage, and beauty. They think just as we do, although in a different way and at a different level of complexity. I believe that reality itself is an intelligent being. This conclusion is not motivated by moral arguments, veganism, or similar concerns. I want to mention this because there is a lot of discussion in philosophical circles about the ethics of eating animals. This goes all the way back to Pythagoreans, who believed eating animals is unethical. However, although I like Pythagorean thought, I am not a vegan. I believe that life survives by consuming life, and I see this as an essential aspect of existence rather than as something inherently wrong. Life continually sacrifices itself for other life. Living beings sustain one another by giving themselves to one another. In this sense, all life exists for the sake of other life. The purpose of life is not merely to continue existing, but to exist in such a way that other forms of life are able to exist because of it. For this reason, I believe that animals and even plants possess intelligence. To eat a plant or to eat an animal is, in my view, to consume different expressions of the same living reality. I know this will sound a little strange, but I believe that plants also possess their own kind of philosophy, their own relationship with Sophia, the personification of wisdom, whom I equate with the world soul. They exhibit characteristic tendencies and patterns of behavior. Every plant develops differently according to the place where it grows, and the environment surrounding it shapes the way it lives. Plants communicate with one another. They often grow in communities where neighboring plants contribute to one another's survival in different ways. Some exchange nutrients, while others provide protection or create favorable conditions for growth. Much of a plant's life takes place beneath the ground, where its roots form close relationships with fungi. These fungi live in symbiosis with plants, helping them obtain nutrients while receiving shelter and nourishment in return. I have even encountered studies suggesting that fungal networks can transmit signals between different plants, functioning in a way that resembles communication across a network. To me, this illustrates that the entire world is alive. I also believe that the universe as a whole possesses its own kind of philosophy as a consequence of the way it behaves. God himself is the first philosopher and greatest lover of wisdom. I do not see motion throughout the universe as the result of accident or anomaly. Wherever I observe movement, I also see intelligence and a form of life. From this perspective, the purpose of our own philosophy and religion is to bring ourselves into harmony with the philosophy of the universe itself. Planets and solar systems each possess their own way of existing. They move, interact, and shape their environments according to their own patterns of activity. They influence one another through gravity, magnetic fields, orbital motion, and countless other forms of interaction that continue throughout their existence. Their manner of being is a necessary condition for our own way of life. Human life depends entirely upon the way galaxies create suitable conditions for solar systems, and the way solar systems, in turn, establish the conditions that allow planets to support life as we know it. I do not believe it is correct to describe these life-supporting conditions as accidental. The conditions necessary for our existence are, in my view, passed down through successive levels of reality, from the universal life of the cosmos to galaxies, from galaxies to solar systems, from solar systems to planets, and finally to us. The fact that we are alive depends upon the fact that the universe itself behaves in a manner that makes life possible. My life is therefore not limited to the existence of my individual organism in a particular place. My life extends throughout reality itself. Our planet is not simply the place where we happen to live. It is part of our very life, just as its own life is part of the greater life of the solar system to which it belongs. As I have already argued, I believe that the whole of reality is a reflection of the Platonic ideas, and that reality unfolds in an intelligent and rational manner. But what exactly does this mean? To answer that question, we first need to understand the relationship between Platonic ideas, or forms, and the material reality that reflects them. Platonic forms are universal truths, while particular things are the many individual expressions of those same truths within the constantly changing world of becoming, which is the material world. I think that probably the best way to describe this in as much detail as possible is by comparing Plato's conception of universal and particular with that of Hegel, who was also idealist, but his conception of reality is somewhat different from that of Plato. To give a quick definition of universals and particulars, we can say that particular is one specific or particular pyramid in Egypt, while universal is an idea of the pyramid that is believed to be a kind of blueprint that all pyramids in the universe have in common. Particular is one specific object that contains some specific instance of some characteristic, while universal is the idea that is believed to be present in, or that it contains all instances of that same characteristic. In that previous video I made about Plato and Hegel, I said that Hegel's universal is not truly universal in the Platonic sense, but represents, in some way, an intersection between universality and particularity. I also explained that Hegel preserves the eternal aspect of the idea by placing the universal prior to the particular because, as Hegel argues, the particular is the other of itself, or its negation. Negation functions as the mediator that distinguishes the particular from the universal by making it the universal's other. I realized that this may have created the impression that I was saying the universal somehow disappears or transforms into the particular. This confusion may have become even greater when I later argued that Hegel, in a certain sense, particularizes the universal by claiming that it develops through historical progress. I also used the example of a pyramid, explaining that the universal form of a pyramid remains a pyramid regardless of how many particular pyramids are built, altered, or destroyed. Looking back, I understand how this could have sounded contradictory. At one moment I appeared to say that Hegel believes in universals, while later I seemed to deny that he does. My intention, however, was to illustrate how Hegel's understanding of the relationship between the universal and the particular differs from my own, which is grounded primarily in Plato. Once this distinction becomes clear, it is easier to understand what I mean when I say that Hegel's universal is not truly universal, at least not in the same way that Plato understands universality. I should have expressed this more clearly, because I can see how it may have caused unnecessary confusion. Hegel certainly believes in the eternal aspect of the idea, and in that sense he accepts something comparable to Platonic forms. The important point is that he understands those forms differently from Plato. It is often assumed that Hegel is concerned only with history and with a reality that is constantly changing, as though he denied eternal truth altogether. That is not an accurate description. Hegel does see reality as a process, but he does not argue that universal truths literally become particular things. Rather, he understands particulars as the content of universals. As the world of particular reality develops, the universal also develops because its content changes, although not in such a way that its essential nature is destroyed. The universal form of a pyramid, for example, can never become the universal form of a square. This much is obvious. Hegel does not claim that when a particular pyramid is destroyed, the universal pyramid disappears as well. Instead, what changes is the content through which the universal is expressed. This is the point I wanted to make, and it is here that Hegel differs from Plato. This is why I said that Hegel's universal is not universal in quite the same way as Plato's. For Plato, the universal is the primary reality, while the particular is not the content of the universal but its image. One could also say that Hegel says this as well, but by this he means something different from Plato, who believes that ideas, or universals, are the primary reality. Hegel, by contrast, understands universals, or Platonic forms, as possessing a kind of emptiness that is filled by particular content, and this content is what gives the universal its meaning. In this way, universality and particularity are united, not as reconciliation of opposing qualities, but more as complementary parts united through the process. This relationship lies at the heart of Hegel's entire philosophical system. If one understands how the universal and the particular relate to one another through this dialectical unity, then one understands the basic structure of Hegel's philosophy, from its first principle to the end of history, where the absolute returns to itself. Hegel's entire system resembles a snake consuming its own tail. The first principle, or the absolute, returns to itself through negation. Just as we have seen through the relationship between universal and particular, one is negated by the other, while at the same time preserving each other through this negation that is at the end negated by itself. This process gives rise to the entire history of reality, from the absolute all the way back to the absolute. The universal, for Hegel, is the eternal aspect of the idea, but it exists as an empty form whose content is provided by finite and changing particularity. This is what I mean when I say that Hegel preserves universal truths while simultaneously understanding them as participating in a process of development. When I say that Hegel believes universals are in a process of change, this is precisely what I mean. It is also the point at which my own view, following Plato, departs from his. For Plato, the eternal ideas are not filled by the content of particular things. The relationship is exactly the reverse. Particular things receive their meaning from the ideas, and as reflections of those ideas they participate in the meanings that the ideas already possess. It is similar to the way a mirror reflects an object. The mirror does not create the object it reflects. Rather, it receives and displays what already exists before it. This is where my interpretation differs from Hegel's. I do not believe that Hegel rejected universal truth or the realm of being. Instead, he consistently treats it as the starting point of the dialectical process. The universal, or the eternal aspect of the idea, functions as an empty form whose meaning is realized through its own negation, that is, through its reflection in particularity. The difference may appear small, but I believe it is philosophically significant. Hegel's universal is reflected in particularity, just as Plato's is, But for Hegel, the universal requires the content of particularity in order to become what it is. In Plato's philosophy, eternal and unchanging ideas are not dependent upon the content of particular things. Perhaps the distinction can be expressed through a simple image. Hegel's universal is like a mirror whose identity depends upon the reflections it contains, whereas Plato's universal is the original object being reflected, while the particulars are merely the reflections appearing in the mirror. The difference between Plato and Hegel is therefore extremely subtle, yet deeply important. Many people, including a great number of serious Hegel scholars who have devoted years to studying his philosophy, do not fully appreciate how close Hegel actually is to Plato when his thought is carefully understood. I would describe Hegel as a kind of Neoplatonic Aristotelian. If one understands both Neoplatonism and Aristotle, then Hegel can be understood as a synthesis of those traditions. What is interesting, however, is that Plato himself also stands behind both of them. Plato is the source from which both the Neoplatonic and Aristotelian traditions emerged, while Hegel is their inheritor. I do not wish to criticize Hegel unfairly because I have enormous respect for his philosophy. My intention is certainly not to declare that Hegel was wrong, nor would I presume to make such a claim. I simply want to explain the difference between Hegel and Plato and clarify why, on this particular question, I find Plato's position more convincing. Even this is perhaps not best described as agreement or disagreement. It is, more than anything else, a matter of philosophical intuition. Hegel had profound respect for Plato and for the Neoplatonic tradition, and I believe that anyone who has seriously studied both the Greek philosophers and Hegel would immediately recognize how closely Hegel, and indeed the whole tradition of German idealism, is connected to this heritage. Plato was a philosopher who brought together the most important insights of those who came before him, including Pythagoras, Parmenides, and Heraclitus. These ideas were later transmitted through Aristotle and the Neoplatonists and continued to influence many philosophical and religious traditions, such as Stoicism, Gnosticism, Hermeticism, and, most significantly, Christianity throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. This entire intellectual lineage ultimately finds one of its highest expressions in German idealism. In my view, German idealism represents the final great movement of philosophy. The schools of thought that emerged after German idealism no longer deserve, in the deepest sense, to be called philosophy. Once the era of German idealism came to an end, philosophy itself largely disappeared from the Western world. I realize that many people will disagree with this statement, but I believe that those who do so often have a very different understanding of what philosophy actually is. I would even say that they have lost sight of its true meaning. Philosophy is not fundamentally concerned with speculation, metaphysics, ontology, or epistemology. These are only secondary aspects. Philosophy is, above all, concerned with life itself, and modern conception of philosophy largely lost this focus. In today's world, philosophy is a kind of word game that is believed to be connected to reality only as a kind of speculation in our thoughts, and if we can apply those thoughts in some situations, good. If not, who cares? While in ancient times philosophy wasn't just a feature of human thinking and speculation, it was considered a kind of living reality. It was something that living organism lives, not just something to think about. Questions about reality, knowledge, and existence arise only because life seeks to understand itself. Hegel was profoundly influenced by Neoplatonism, and he conceived of reality in terms that closely resemble the Neoplatonic worldview. According to the Neoplatonists, the One is the source from which everything proceeds, and ultimately everything returns to it. It is both the beginning and the end simultaneously. Hegel embraces this same fundamental structure, and the unfolding of this return is what he understands as the history of reality. Within Neoplatonism, the concept of the One is identified with the highest principle in Plato's dialogues, the idea of the good, which Plato considers to be the source of the entire reality. However, I believe that philosophers such as Plotinus never intended to replace Plato's conception of the good with something fundamentally different. At the same time, I think Plato's presentation of the good possesses greater depth and greater philosophical force than Plotinus' account of the one. Plotinus certainly describes the one as the highest principle, just as Plato presents the good as the supreme reality. Yet Plato's good is not merely the source from which all existence proceeds. It is also described as that which illuminates the intellect itself, making knowledge possible, while simultaneously granting existence to all forms. In Plotinus, the one is presented primarily as the ultimate source of reality standing beyond all forms, with the forms existing within its emanation. Although this is a profoundly beautiful conception, I believe Plato attributes even greater significance to the form of the good. In Plotinus, the one can sometimes appear almost like an empty center from which everything unfolds, with the world of forms belonging to the subsequent level of reality. Plato, by contrast, describes the good as the very light by which the intellect sees. It is not simply the origin of existence, but the fullness of intellectual illumination itself. If I were to express the difference symbolically, I would say that Plotinus sometimes presents the supreme principle almost like an empty circle from which reality emerges, whereas Plato presents it more like a circle completely filled with light. The good is the perfect source of intellect, truth, and being. I believe this is one of the principal differences between Plato and the Neoplatonists, although I do not think it represents a genuine disagreement. The Neoplatonists were not deliberately altering Plato's philosophy. Their intention was to remain faithful to his teachings. Nevertheless, I think they unintentionally shifted emphasis by treating the highest principle more as the background of reality than as its active source. For Plato, the good is not merely the foundation upon which reality rests. It is the eternal source that continuously gives existence, intelligibility, and power to the forms, to souls, and to reality itself. For this reason, I regard Plato's philosophy as the purest expression of idealism. Everything depends upon ideas, while the whole course of history exists only as their reflection rather than as their primary embodiment. Ideas are eternal meanings, they never change, they never come into or pass out of existence, and they can never be destroyed. Hegel, on the other hand, understands reality through the unity of opposites. His philosophy is famous for explaining how what appears contradictory is actually not a contradiction, but an essential aspect of the process where everything is united in emergence of reality through the activity of the spirit. As we already said in the previous video, this is not happening through that famous formula that is often misattributed to Hegel: thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but through the movement of negation through the absolute. This movement of negation is not expressed through contradictions being reconciled. This is why I said, this reconciliation reminds me of that mistaken formula, thesis-synthesis, and I therefore decided to stop using it when referring to Hegel. To properly explain this negation and unfolding of reality, it is not correct to just say that opposing forces are clashing with each other to create a third one, because these seemingly opposing forces are already present within unity that emerges from itself and returns to itself. There are no oppositions or merging of opposites. There is only emergence of everything from nothing and return of everything to nothing. We can't speak about oppositions because there is nothing to be opposed in the first place. Hegel understands the universal almost as though it were a container whose identity includes the many particulars that belong to it. This is why the universal can develop through the development of particularity, because the particular content associated with the universal is constantly changing. Reality is structured by reason and contains eternal principles. It even preserves the eternal aspect of the idea, or the form itself. Truth becomes concrete through dialectical unfolding. There are universal forms that remain, yet their content develops through the process of becoming. This is why opposites must ultimately be united within dialectic in Hegel's system. My own perspective is somewhat different. I believe this dialectical process belongs entirely to the realm of becoming. From our limited perspective, it often seems impossible to capture reality as something complete and unchanging. Instead, every perspective appears to be constantly developing, and so we conclude that all viewpoints must remain open to future revision. No perspective ever seems entirely concrete, because it always carries within it the possibility of further development. In this sense, every perspective appears to be both true and incomplete at the same time. I think, however, that the issue is deeper than this. The problem is not that no perspective can ever be true. Rather, every perspective is true in some respect. Every answer contains truth in one way or another. Even when we are completely mistaken, that very mistake is itself part of the truth. If it were not true that we were mistaken, then how could error even exist? When I hold an incorrect belief, the fact that I am mistaken is itself a truth. Truth encompasses everything at once. Falsehood and deception are not external opposites standing against truth. They are distortions that exist within truth itself and remain entirely dependent upon it. No one can stand outside truth in order to oppose it, because even the act of opposition belongs within truth. This is not because truth continually transforms itself into its opposite. Rather, it is because truth is so complete and so concrete that what appears to oppose it is not truly its opposite at all. Every apparent opposition ultimately belongs to the same reality. The remarkable thing is that I am almost certain Hegel would agree with this statement. Yet I believe he would understand it in a very different way from the way I do. I know there is a genuine difference between our positions, although I often struggle to express exactly where that difference lies. Like Hegel, I believe that opposites are ultimately united. However, my reason for believing this is different. Hegel understands this unity through the dialectical movement of the absolute, whereas I believe opposites are united precisely because the absolute is not itself caught in an endless dialectical process. I realize this is not yet a fully satisfying explanation, but it is the closest I can presently come to expressing the distinction. It often feels as though I am using the same language as Hegel while intending something fundamentally different. Hegel uses his dialectic of negation as an engine for creating difference within the absolute, but this negation is eventually removed. It is at the end negated by itself. Don't get me wrong, Hegel's concept of negation is crucial. It is immanent within the absolute idea, but it is important to understand that negation is a tool for the movement of reality, not some kind of cancelling of reality. The only thing that is being cancelled is negation itself. For example, universal is negated by the particular as the other of itself, but the universal is not truly negated in a way that it stops being universal. It is still what it is even after being negated. So Hegel's union of opposites is not happening because of negation. The opposites were always reconciled from the beginning, but negation is an engine that brings this reality into consciousness. Hegel's philosophy is of such nature that you can't pin it down. Whatever you say has some kind of explanation within his system. And this is why, when I say that both Plato and Hegel have all opposites reconciled, but at the same time this is reconciled differently, I truly can't find words how to explain the difference in this particular aspect of their thought. Yes, Plato's reality is reality of defined archetypal patterns, while Hegel's reality is a process, but both of these realities account for exactly the same principles but in different ways. This is why Hegel's opposites are explained through negation, because his entire reality is an ever-changing process and opposites are always moments within this process, while in Plato's philosophy we have this eternal ball of light, the pleroma, full with all ideas and eternal archetypal patterns, where all opposites are eternally united. Valentinian Gnostic Christians had a concept called Syzygy that signifies this union of opposites within the pleroma. They identified the pleroma with Plato's realm of forms, which, filled with the light of the good, creates 30 eons, 15 pairs of opposites that provide power for the process of becoming, and the process is happening on the canvas that this light shines upon, and Hegel's reality has no such light. Hegel's reality is just the canvas. We could say that for Hegel, reality of becoming is in itself the pleroma or fullness of light. This is also where I find Schopenhauer's criticism of Hegel especially interesting. Schopenhauer was himself an idealist and was deeply influenced by Plato. In certain respects, I find his understanding of universal truths closer to my own. Like both Plato and Hegel, Schopenhauer regarded particular things as reflections of universals. Yet he remained closer to Plato by assigning greater priority to eternal universality itself. For Schopenhauer, the universal idea possesses meaning in its own right, and that universal meaning is what gives significance to particular things. In this respect, his position resembles that of the Neo-Platonists. The difference between Hegel and Schopenhauer is not enormous, but it is significant. Schopenhauer places primary emphasis upon eternity, whereas Hegel places primary emphasis upon process. Schopenhauer criticized Hegel precisely because he believed that Hegel diminished truth by placing everything within an endless movement of historical development. For Schopenhauer, genuine philosophy is not primarily concerned with history or the changing process of particular events. Its true subject is eternal and unchanging truth. In many ways, Schopenhauer approached philosophy with a more scientific temperament than Hegel. At the same time, Hegel possessed philosophical strengths that, in my view, brought him closer to Plato in other important respects. Although Hegel never directly responded to Schopenhauer's repeated criticisms and personal attacks, I can understand how Hegel might have replied from within his own philosophical framework. Schopenhauer argued that the will, which serves as the ultimate source of reality in his philosophy, is fundamentally irrational. It is pure striving without reason. Hegel, on the other hand, understood reality as rational through and through. For Hegel, reality itself is reason, logic, and spirit unfolding. I am aware of Schopenhauer's principle of sufficient reason, yet within his philosophy this principle ultimately arises from the irrational will. This leaves me uncertain about how Schopenhauer fully integrated the Platonic ideas into his system, because Platonic ideas are, to me, the very embodiment of rationality. To grasp a Platonic form is to grasp logic itself, and this is something Hegel understood profoundly. It is for this reason that I agree completely with Hegel's conviction that reality and spirit are rational at their very core. The idea, whether understood in its universal or particular expression, but especially in its eternal and universal form, represents the highest immutable truth. It is logic itself embodied within reality. Therefore, Schopenhauer's irrational will does not contain Platonic idea in a proper Platonic sense, because if it is to contain any kind of Platonic idea, it must be rational. Platonic idea is reason, it is intellect in itself, it is not a product of will or mind, it is mind. While Hegel, on the other hand, recognized that idea and being, or idea and consciousness or mind, are one and the same thing. In Schopenhauer, ideas are like objects located within consciousness, while in Hegel, ideas are consciousness. Don't get me wrong, Schopenhauer also says that everything is consciousness or the will. However, he says that ideas are more like things that appear within consciousness. Ideas are natural consequence of this kind of existence of the will. And I used to think like this exactly. I used to believe that ideas exist within consciousness, but over the years studying Hegel, I came to the conclusion that it is the opposite. Now I believe that it is more correct to say that ideas produce consciousness. This is what Plato says, and only after studying Hegel for these last few years, I came to this conclusion, and in order for this to be true, reality itself, like Hegel concluded, must be reasonable. Ideas themselves are logic. In Hegel, these ideas are the reality of becoming, while for Plato, ideas are eternal. When you think about it a little bit, it is understandable how Schopenhauer concluded that irrational will contains ideas, because he believed ideas are a consequence of its existence and movement. He was inspired by Plato in claiming ideas, but he did not follow him completely in this respect. However, Hegel did much more closely. This is precisely why Schopenhauer could conclude that reason and ideas can appear within the irrational will, because ideas depend upon it, while Hegel and Plato had to conclude that reality is guided by reason and intelligence, because they believed that ideas themselves are not subordinate to consciousness as its byproduct. We can even say it is precisely the opposite. On this point, I find myself agreeing with Hegel. I believe that without intelligence or reason, nothing could ever happen at all. Even the will, if it is to move or act in any way, already belongs to the domain of intelligence. Movement itself presupposes intelligence. I understand that Schopenhauer did not share this conclusion, but this is my own philosophical conviction. But even Hegel and Schopenhauer both, like the Neoplatonists, who wanted to follow Plato completely, none of them, I believe, did not fully understand the importance Plato placed upon idea. Schopenhauer gives priority to the will, which is the universal mind or field of subjectivity that is the ground of all being. Hegel, a bit closer to Plato in this respect, united subjectivity and idea, while the Neoplatonists, who were the closest to Plato in this respect, placed ideas in a kind of divine intelligence which isn't precisely identical to a human subject or soul, but is a kind of transpersonal intellect that contains all the forms which it uses for creation of the soul and matter. However, I also believe that Plato gives clear primacy to ideas over subjectivity, and even over this Neoplatonic divine intellect. In Plato, this divine intellect does not contain ideas. Like in Neoplatonism, it is the opposite. Ideas contain and give rise to the intellect. As I said, I don't think Neoplatonists deliberately moved away from Plato. I believe that they honestly believed that ideas must exist within some kind of intellect. I used to believe this as well. I thought nothing else makes sense, but I realized that it does make perfect sense, that ideas are primary reality, and Plato's idea of the good produces all other ideas and the intellect as the movement or the activity of these ideas. Ideas do not exist within intellect. Ideas produce divine intellect or the demiurge as a consequence of their intellectual power, and this demiurge then has the ability to use these ideas like a craftsman uses the material for his work. Just like a builder can't build a house without material, intellect can't think without ideas. Therefore, Neoplatonists give primacy to the divine intellect, whereas Schopenhauer gives primacy to universal field of subjectivity, while Hegel ultimately arrives at a unity between the two. As I argued in my previous video, I think the unity of subjectivity and idea is already present in Plato. The crucial difference is that, for Plato, subjectivity arises from ideas rather than the other way around. Without ideas, there can be no subject. The form of the good is the beginning of subjectivity itself, which is why Plato describes it as the light of the mind. It is the original light that grants the mind its capacity to see. Plato never develops this point into a separate doctrine, largely because it was not a central philosophical problem during his own time. Nevertheless, it is implicitly present throughout his account of the soul and its relation to reality. In several dialogues, Plato even describes the soul as a kind of form. In the Phaedo, for example, he discusses the immortality of the soul by arguing that the soul participates in, or embodies, the form of life. Because life itself is an eternal and unchanging idea, the soul cannot truly admit death. Yet, unlike Hegel or Schopenhauer, Plato never makes the relationship between subjectivity and ideas the primary focus of his philosophy. If we consider his thought as a whole, I believe it is evident that ideas always retain priority over subjectivity, even if ideas and subjectivity are inseparable, and I believe they must be if reality itself is generated through ideas. Plato still maintains that ideas are more than merely objects grasped by a subject. They certainly can be known objectively, but they are also the very ground of all being. Ideas possess priority not only over the external world, but even over subjectivity itself. They do not arise from a subject, rather, subjectivity emerges from them. The subject is itself an embodied idea whose archetype exists prior to its manifestation. When the demiurge fashions the world soul and creates the universe as a living being, Plato tells us that this creation is modeled upon the eternal paradigm. And what is this eternal paradigm if not the realm of ideas? Ideas are primary reality, while even subjectivity remains subordinate to them. I personally think Hegel recognized that both Plato and the Neoplatonists had already implied a profound unity between idea and subject, and I think this recognition stands behind one of his most important theories, the unity of thought and being. After all, if Plato declares that the form of the good is the first principle and the source of everything, then every soul and every subject must ultimately arise as an expression of that first principle. In this sense, subjectivity and idea are united because every subject originates from ideas. One of the aspects of Hegel's philosophy that influenced me most deeply is precisely this claim that thought and being are fundamentally united. It became one of the central principles shaping my own understanding of idealism, even though I believe Plato had already anticipated something very similar. Before reading Hegel, I believed that ideas necessarily depended upon some mind or subject, specifically the mind of God. I imagined that everything in reality, including every soul, existed as an idea within the divine intellect. Life itself appeared to me as a divine idea, but I still thought those ideas were produced by God. Reading Hegel gradually changed this view. I came to believe that ideas and mind are not related as creator and product, but are united from the very beginning. Thought and being are inseparable. This eventually became, for me, the proper way of understanding not only reality but even God himself. At the same time, I remained convinced that Plato was right to place ideas at the highest level of reality, rather than a subject that supposedly produces them. Ideas are eternal, but they are not merely static abstractions, they are themselves living realities. When the idea of the good, as the first light, illuminates other eternal meanings or ideas, this gives rise to various archetypal intellects that the Gnostics call the eons. This place of eternal meaning is called the pleroma. It is a place where, from the illumination of eternal ideas by the power of the good, arise various intellectual powers that are manifested in the demiurge, the divine intellect that uses the eternal archetypes to craft the material world as a living being. I am not referring here to those Gnostic sects that believed in an evil creator. People usually think that Gnosticism is about evil God, but this is not true. Gnostic Christians, like Valentinian school that interests me the most, follows Plato completely, and they apply his philosophy to Gnostic Christian mythology. Plotinus wrote against Gnostics, however. He wrote against those who claim that Creator is evil. This is specifically the title of that part where he writes against the Gnostics, and I completely agree with Plotinus' criticism against these Gnostic schools. However, Valentinian school does not belong here. They believe the demiurge plays a role in necessity. Like in Platonism, he is not evil, on the contrary, he is good and just. Valentinus follows Plato in some ways even closer than the Neoplatonists, for example in claiming the highest principle as the source of all intellectual light, not just as the background of reality, but as the direct power of intellect that provides existence to all ideas and higher archetypal intellects that use this light in order to create lower worlds as its emanations. At the end, everything, all the ideas, eons, the demiurge, and the world soul, are at the end expressions of the idea of the good, the first light and the source of all intellectual power. Plato agrees with Hegel and Schopenhauer that all beings participate in one underlying divine intelligence. At the same time, however, he leaves much more room for objective distinction and for explaining how genuinely different beings can exist as separate realities while remaining united within a single metaphysical order. The good is not merely something in which everything participates. Rather, the good radiates intellectual light, and that light is expressed through many distinct archetypes that establish both sameness and difference throughout reality. Within Plato's philosophy, we are not simply identical expressions of one undifferentiated reality. Every being and every existing thing embodies its own distinct eternal archetype or a combination of archetypal patterns. In the end, all of these philosophers are attempting to explain the same fundamental metaphysical problem: how unity can remain primary while still giving rise to genuine multiplicity. Their ultimate goal is remarkably similar, but the manner in which they express this truth differs considerably. They all agree that unity is the primary principle and that multiplicity proceeds from the absolute. Consequently, there is no essential disagreement concerning the relationship between unity and multiplicity themselves. The real differences lie in the philosophical language and metaphysical framework through which each thinker articulates this relationship. I often notice that people influenced by various forms of idealism are inclined to claim that we are all literally the very same being, that everyone is identical, that I am you and you are me. To a certain extent, I also accept this intuition, because there is undeniably a profound unity underlying all existence. Nevertheless, unity is only one side of the picture. Difference is equally fundamental and deserves the same degree of philosophical attention. Reality is not composed solely of unity, but of unity expressed through genuine multiplicity. To understand the whole, we must acknowledge not only what all things share in common, but also the real distinctions that allow individual beings to exist as unique expressions of the same ultimate source. The teachings of non-duality, particularly Vedanta, which in many respects closely resembles Schopenhauer's philosophy, place tremendous emphasis on the idea that every being and everything is ultimately one and the same reality. During his lifetime, Schopenhauer owned several dogs, and he gave each of them the name Atman. In Vedic philosophy, Atman refers to the soul or the subject, and it is understood to be identical in essence with Brahman, the ultimate reality or universal subject that encompasses everything. Whenever one of his dogs died, Schopenhauer would acquire another of the same breed and once again name it Atman, because he believed that each was fundamentally the very same expression of the universal will. The difficulty, however, is that when people arrive at this realization of underlying unity, they sometimes become so absorbed by it that they begin to lose sight of reality as it is actually experienced. I even saw many people on the internet who follow this kind of teaching, and they eventually conclude that nothing truly exists, or that it makes no difference whether one is alive or dead because everything is ultimately one universal subject. I am not claiming that Schopenhauer himself held such an extreme position. He in fact advocated against inflicting harm upon oneself and other, and he actually had a very developed ethical philosophy that influenced me in this sense a lot, and I fully recognize the profound value of perceiving the underlying unity of all life. Nevertheless, there is also a danger in placing excessive emphasis upon unity alone. Plato teaches that anyone wishing to understand reality completely must pass through the dialectic of understanding both sameness and difference. Neither is more real than the other. Difference is just as fundamental as sameness, and difference itself belongs within unity. Both sameness and difference are equally genuine expressions of the same ultimate reality. The existence of difference does not imply conflict or opposition. Genuine unity does not consist in reducing everything to the same thing. Rather, it consists in recognizing difference itself as an expression of unity. Hegel, by contrast, would say something different from Schopenhauer. At least in my opinion, he does not argue that everything is simply the same. Instead, he argues that difference or apparent opposition is present in every individual thing. However, this difference is not truly a difference, but difference mediated through negation of a thing and its apparent other, that is at the same time itself and the other of itself. What I want to say is that in Hegel difference is clearly and rationally expressed even though everything is at the end united into the absolute. Because the absolute, similar to that of Plato, expresses itself through various archetypal ideas that unfold through dialectic or negation and in this way express themselves as reality. Accordingly, unity is constantly negated by multiplicity because multiplicity is simultaneously itself and its own other. Unity is multiplicity, and multiplicity is unity. In this respect, Schopenhauer tends toward the conclusion that everything is unified as one single reality, whereas Hegel emphasizes that everything is united through the dynamic relationship between a thing and its apparent opposite. Plato, however, preserves a different solution. For him, everything is united not because everything is literally the same nor because opposites are united. Rather, unity consists of complementary principles. Sameness and difference are not opposites but equally necessary expressions of the whole. Unity remains both the beginning and the end, while multiplicity unfolds within it. The important point is that our understanding of reality must leave proper room for this unfolding. I therefore believe almost everyone agrees that unity must remain primary, but I also believe that multiplicity does not diminish it but simply belongs to its nature. Therefore, I actually believe that Plato and Hegel are very similar in this respect. However, they are not literally saying the same thing. Hegel's unification occurs as a consequence of everything, all opposites arising from the same process, while for Plato, opposites are not united at all, and yet regardless of this fact they are also considered to be united. You might wonder how is this possible, and in my opinion, it is possible because of the way reality unfolds in Plato's philosophy. Yes, everything begins from the idea of the good, but as the idea of the good, or the intellectual light that proceeds from the good unfolds, it passes through various archetypal patterns through its emanation. So before it reaches the world of becoming, it already defined the differentiation patterns in its higher emanation that are then instantiated in its lower emanation, or in the world of becoming. So what is united in the higher worlds does not need to be united in the lower world. We can give an example of the Gnostic concept of the anthropos, archetypal human being that unites all humans in the higher realm, while individual human expressions of this archetype all possess various archetypal characteristics that participate differently in different forms. In the Sophist, Plato explains that sameness is a kind shared by all things belonging to the same genus with respect to a particular characteristic, making collection and division possible. Difference is likewise a kind, enabling members of the same genus to be distinguished from one another and allowing genuine differentiation to occur. Plato also argues that what is called not being should not be understood as the opposite of being, but simply as something different from it. From this perspective, I think that Hegel and Plato also agree. The only difference lies in the fact that Hegel does not believe in emanation from higher to lower. We could say that his emanation is not happening vertically but more horizontally. What I want to say is that Hegel's process is not happening between higher and lower. Everything is happening on the same level of reality. The right way to describe it, in my opinion, would be like a self-devouring process that gives rise to itself through this self-devouring. I personally believe that Hegel can be described as a Platonist who brought this process of emanation down to earth. Apparent opposites do not stand against one another in an absolute sense. If we carry this conclusion to its furthest implications, they actually become the conditions for one another's existence. Both Hegel and Plato believe this, and I think each of them has the same reason for believing it, as both see the truth as something that we can't escape. Even non-being and falsehood are parts of it. The only difference lies in the structure of reality between Platonic realm of forms and Hegelian dialectical unfolding of becoming. Hegel generally understands opposites as being defined through negation, while Plato understands them less as negations and more as necessary differences. They are distinct without existing in absolute opposition, and together they complete the intelligible structure of reality. When discussing complementary difference, the concept of the pair, or syzygy, occupies a central place within Valentinian thought. A syzygy refers to the union of complementary qualities, known as eons, which together constitute a complete and harmonious state called the pleroma. These syzygies were traditionally understood as male-female pairs. Thus, depth, mind, word, and humanity represented the masculine aspect of the divine, while silence, truth, life, and church represented its corresponding feminine aspect. From these primordial principles, a further series of syzygies emerged through the process of emanation, ultimately producing a total of 15 complementary pairs, or 30 eons. This perfectly ordered realm of united archetypal principles is known as the pleroma, a term meaning fullness or completion. According to Valentinian teaching, the complementary aspects that originally formed each syzygy have become separated within the material world through the activity of Sophia, giving rise to a condition of deficiency, known as the hysterema. Valentinus taught that every human being contains within themselves a divine seed, the pneuma, which must ultimately be reunited with its heavenly counterpart, or angel, thereby restoring the original syzygy. Because of ignorance, we frequently mistake complementary realities for absolute opposites. This idea is expressed beautifully in the Gospel of Philip, which states, "Light and darkness, life and death, right and left are mutually dependent. It is impossible for them to separate." Qualities that are commonly treated as opposites are, in reality, inseparable from one another. Maleness cannot be understood without femaleness, just as darkness cannot be understood apart from light. The apparent division into opposites is itself an illusion produced by ignorance. This illusory condition can be overcome through the reunification of the pneuma with its heavenly counterpart. Valentinian tradition identifies this restoration as gnosis, which simultaneously signifies knowledge of God and reunion with one's divine complement. Through this process, the apparent divisions that arise from dualistic thinking are dissolved as the soul returns to the fullness of the pleroma. Restoration to unity enables the mystic to transcend illusion and perceive reality as it truly is. This does not mean that life and death cease to exist as distinct expressions of reality. Rather, They come to be understood as complementary aspects of a greater whole that mutually depend upon one another. This is the true meaning of gnosis and the dissolution of illusion. Reality itself is not altered. Instead, our understanding is transformed so that we perceive reality without the distortions imposed by ignorance. Valentinus expresses this in the Gospel of Truth. Inasmuch as the deficiency came into being because the Father was not known, from the moment the Father is known the deficiency will not exist. As with a person's ignorance, when one receives gnosis, ignorance passes away of its own accord. As darkness vanishes when light appears, so also deficiency vanishes in completion. From that moment on the realm of appearance is no longer manifest, but rather passes away in the harmony of unity. From this, it is evident that Valentinianism presents a fundamentally monistic worldview. According to Valentinus, the divine alone possesses ultimate reality. Distinctions such as body and mind, soul and matter, persist only because of ignorance. To attain gnosis of God is to see beyond these apparent divisions and to experience reality as the fullness, or pleroma, of the divine.